There are restaurants in this world where the waiting list is not measured in weeks, but in seasons, where a reservation requires more than a phone call. It requires a quiet word from someone who already belongs, and where the price of a single evening could cover a month of someone's rent without anyone at the table blinking twice. Auberge Sainte-Claire in Montreal was exactly that kind of place. It sat on a narrow street in old Montreal, where the cobblestones had been worn smooth by 2 centuries of footsteps, tucked between a private law firm and a building that had once been a convent. There was no sign above the door. There had never been a sign. If you needed a sign, you were not the kind of person they were expecting. Inside, the lighting was low and amber, the kind that made everyone look like they were being painted by candlelight. The linen was changed between every seating. The sommelier, a quiet man named Armand, who had worked there for 19 years, could identify a Burgundy vintage by nose alone in under 30 seconds. The kitchen held 1 Michelin star, but had been offered a second and quietly declined, on the grounds that the additional attention would compromise the experience for the guests they already had. Every table was spoken for 6 months in advance. On a Thursday evening in late October, when the first frost had already silvered the iron railings outside and the city smelled of wood smoke and wet stone, a woman named Simone Audet arrived for her shift at 4:45 before the first guests would be seated. She was 28 years old. She had dark hair pulled back with the precise neatness that the restaurant required, and she moved through the dining room the way she always did, quietly, efficiently, with the particular kind of calm that comes not from indifference, but from a person who has decided deliberately not to let the noise of the world touch her while she is working. The maître d', a lean man called Felix, who wore the same expression of studied composure every evening, regardless of what was happening in the kitchen, handed her the seating chart for the night. "Table 7 is yours," he said. "Full party of 4, arriving at 7:30. Name on the reservation is Whitfield." He paused in a way that Simone had learned over 18 months of working alongside him meant something specific. "Conrad Whitfield," Felix added. She looked up from the chart. Conrad Whitfield was not a name that required explanation in any room in Canada and in most rooms in the English-speaking world. He had built his first company at 26, sold it at 31 for a number that required more than 10 figures, and then proceeded to do it again, twice more, in different industries, as though the first time had simply been practice. At 44, he was one of the wealthiest men in the country. He was also, by all accounts, extraordinarily difficult. The financial press described him as a disruptor, a visionary, a man who thought in decades while others thought in quarters. His former employees described him in language that was less flattering and considerably more accurate. He had a reputation for testing people, for finding the precise point at which they would crumble under pressure and then pressing exactly there, not out of malice, he would have insisted, but out of what he genuinely believed was a commitment to excellence. Only the best, he liked to say. He had no patience for anything less. Simone looked at the table number and said nothing. She knew the table. Table 7 was in the far corner, positioned so that the occupants could see the entire room, but were not easily observed themselves. It was the most requested table in the restaurant. It was also the most difficult to serve, because the sightline from the kitchen required her to cross the full length of the dining room twice for every course. "Of course," she said, and handed the chart back to Felix. What Felix did not know, what almost no one in that dining room knew, was that Simone had not always been a server at Auberge Sainte-Claire. She had been, 3 years earlier, a doctoral candidate in comparative linguistics at McGill University. working on a dissertation about syntactic convergence in minority language families of Western Europe. She had spoken, by that point, 7 languages with varying degrees of fluency: French and English natively, Italian and Spanish at the level of a native speaker after spending 2 years of her undergraduate degree in Bologna and Seville, and then German, Welsh, and Breton in the years that followed, because the intersection of those 3 with the broader Celtic and Germanic branches had been central to her research. She had been 3 months from submitting her dissertation when her mother was diagnosed. It was a phrase that collapsed time, that kind of sentence. Her mother was diagnosed, and everything that had been the future rearranged itself into something else entirely. The waiting lists, the specialists, the second opinions that were not covered, and the treatments that were not covered, and the travel to Toronto for the consultation that was not covered. Her father had died when Simone was 19, and her mother had no one else, and the money that had been earmarked for the final year of Simone's research had become, without ceremony or discussion, the money for something more urgent. She had deferred, then deferred again. By the 3rd year, the deferral had quietly become something else. She was not bitter about it. That was the thing that people assumed when they learned her history, and it was the assumption she found most exhausting. She was not bitter. She was practical. She had found a job in a restaurant because she was good with people, spoke excellent French, and had a memory for detail that her supervisor at McGill had once described in a letter of reference she still kept in a folder on her laptop as genuinely exceptional. Auberge St. Clair paid better than most places as she could have worked, and the hours, difficult as they were, left her mornings free to sit with her mother when her mother had the energy for company. She was not bitter. She was simply here, doing this work, and she intended to do it well. The Whitfield party arrived at 7:43. Conrad Whitfield came in first, the way men who were accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around them always did. Not rudely, exactly, but with a gravitational certainty that suggested he had never had reason to question whether a space would receive him. He was taller than he appeared in photographs, with the kind of physical presence that wealth and confidence sustained over decades sometimes produced. His suit was charcoal and impeccably cut. He wore no tie. His watch was not ostentatious. He had long since passed the point where ostentation was necessary. Behind him came his 2 colleagues, men Simone recognized from the brief she had read on the reservation, both senior partners at Whitfield's latest Lief venture, a private equity firm that had been making quiet and substantial moves in the Canadian healthcare sector. And behind them, last through the door, came a woman Simone did not recognize. She was perhaps 60, silver-haired, wearing a jacket the color of deep water. She moved the way people moved when they had nothing left to prove. She signed the guest book at Felix's station with a single unhurried line, and Felix, who Simone had never seen treat any guest with anything warmer than professional warmth, inclined his head to her in a way that suggested genuine respect. Her name, as Simone would learn, was Dr. Margot Fleury. She sat on the board of 3 national health foundations and had spent 30 years building, dismantling, and rebuilding healthcare access programs across the country. She was not there as a guest of Whitfield. She was there because Whitfield's firm wanted something from her, specifically her endorsement of their entry into the Quebec healthcare market, without which several key regulatory conversations would become considerably more difficult. She had accepted the dinner invitation with the equanimity of someone who had learned, a long time ago, how to read a room before anyone in it thought she had started looking. Simone led the party to table 7, offered the menus, explained the evening's tasting selections, and asked whether anyone had dietary considerations she should relay to the kitchen. The two colleagues said nothing. Dr. Fleury asked one quiet question about the fish course. Whitfield looked at the menu without reading it, and then looked at Simone. "What's the kitchen using tonight?" he asked. "For the game bird. Grouse, Mr. Whitfield, from a farm in the eastern townships. Chef Beauregard works with them exclusively from October through January. It's served with a celery root puree and a reduction made from the pan drippings and a small amount of apple brandy from the Rougemont region." Whitfield held her gaze for a moment. Something in his expression shifted very slightly. The assessment of a man who was always, at some level, testing, and the wine pairing. "Armand can walk you through the full pairing, but if I may, the grouse pairs particularly well with what he's chosen, a Gevry Chambertin from a small producer in Burgundy. It's got enough structure to hold up to the game without overwhelming the apple in the reduction." Whitfield said nothing. He looked at the menu again. "I'll start with the scallop," he said, "and I want something off-list." Simone waited. "Armand will know what I mean," Whitfield said. "Tell him, I want the bottle we discussed in September." She did not ask for clarification. She went to Armand, who did know what he meant, and who retrieved from the cellar a bottle that had been set aside specifically for this occasion. When she brought it to the table, Whitfield watched her carry it with the kind of attention a man pays to something when he is deciding whether to be impressed. He was not yet. The first two courses passed without incident. Whitfield spoke mostly to his colleagues, in the measured, deliberate cadences of a man who chose every word the way other people chose investments, carefully, with a clear sense of what return he expected. Dr. Fleury spoke rarely, but listened with the particular quality of attention that Simone had learned from years of observation was the most dangerous kind in any room, total and apparently effortless. It was between the second and third course, while Simone was describing the provenance of the cheese that would accompany the intermezzo, that Whitfield interrupted her. He did not do it loudly. That was not his way. He simply began speaking in a different language, mid-sentence, as though the shift were the most natural thing in the world. What he said, in Welsh, was this: "Does this one actually understand what she's talking about, or is she reciting from a card in the back?" It was a sentence designed for a specific purpose. Welsh was not a language that appeared on any reasonable list of things a Montreal restaurant server might speak. It was the kind of linguistic grenade a man threw when he was confident there would be no one in the room to catch it. When he wanted to say something cutting in front of its target, without the target having any recourse. His two colleagues, both Anglophone to their cause, smiled with the slightly uneasy recognition that something had been said, even if they could not be certain what. Simone was in the process of describing an aged Comté from the Jura. She finished the sentence she was in the middle of. She set down the small card she had been referencing, and then, in Welsh that was clear and unhurried and grammatically precise, she said, "She understands perfectly. The Comté is aged for a minimum of 18 months, which gives it the crystalline texture you'll notice and a flavor profile that moves from nutty to something closer to caramel at the finish. And to answer your question directly, no, there is no card." The table went very still. One of the colleagues set down his fork. The other looked at Whitfield. Whitfield looked at Simone. For a moment, nothing moved. Then Whitfield said, in English, his voice giving away almost nothing, "Where did you learn Welsh?" "My doctoral research," Simone said in English, equally even. "Comparative linguistics. The Celtic branch was central to my dissertation. I also spent a semester at Bangor University in North Wales. The program there is exceptional." She refilled the nearest water glass without being asked, said she would return with the third course shortly, and walked back toward the kitchen. Behind her, she heard nothing. The table had not recovered its rhythm yet. In the kitchen, Chef Beauregard looked up from the pass. "Everything all right out there?" "Fine," Simone said. The third course went smoothly. So did the fourth. Whitfield had regrouped. He was, whatever else he was, not a man who allowed himself to be visibly rattled for long. And the conversation at table 7 had returned to the business at hand, which was, as far as Simone could observe in passing, the careful work of convincing Dr. Fleury that Whitfield's firm's expansion into healthcare was motivated by something other than profit margin. Dr. Fleury was not yet convinced. Just before the cheese course, proper cheese, the final savory note before dessert, Whitfield tried again. This time he chose Breton. It was, in some ways, a more sophisticated choice than Welsh. Breton was a Brythonic Celtic language, closely related to Welsh and Cornish, but spoken almost exclusively in the western tip of France and sufficiently obscure that most speakers of French would have no meaningful comprehension of it. He said, in Breton, directed at his colleague, but clearly intended for Simone's ears, "Ask her what year the Gevrey Chambertin is. Let's see if she actually knows or if she's been bluffing all evening." Simone placed the cheese board on the table. She identified each cheese by region and age, as she always did, moving from the freshest to the most aged. And then, as she straightened, she said, in Breton, that she had last spoken aloud at a conference in Rennes 4 years ago, but which came back to her the way all languages did, as muscle memory, as something lived in, rather than merely learned. The Gevrey Chambertin is the 2017. It was a cool year in Burgundy, which slowed the ripening and produced a wine with more acidity and greater aging potential than the warmer vintages on either side of it. Armand has been holding it specifically for this reason. It's just reaching its first window. In another 5 years it will be exceptional. She let a small pause settle. "I wasn't bluffing," she said. "I never do." She removed an empty glass from the edge of the table, nodded once to the group, and walked away. What happened at table 7 in the minutes that followed was not something Simone was present for, but it was something that Dr. Margot Fleury described later, in detail, to a colleague of her own. Whitfield had sat in silence for a moment that his associates found difficult to gauge, and then, quietly, almost to himself, he had said, "She's been 3 moves ahead of me all evening." Dr. Fleury, who had noticed Simone from the first course, and had been paying careful attention ever since, not to the food, but to the person serving it, set down her wine glass. "Yes," she said, "she has." It was the first full sentence Dr. Fleury had directed at Whitfield all evening that did not concern the terms of the proposed agreement. After the dessert course, after the petit fours, after Armand had been called to the table and praised by Whitfield in the particular way powerful men praised things that surprised them, briefly, almost grudgingly, as though generosity of spirit were a resource to be rationed, Simone was clearing the final glasses when she felt a presence beside her and looked up. Dr. Fleury had stood and moved to where Simone was working, slightly apart from the table. "I hope you'll forgive a direct question," Dr. Fleury said. Her voice was quiet and precise, the voice of someone who had spent a lifetime in rooms where precision mattered. "Of course," Simone said. "Your linguistic background, doctoral research, you said. Where did that stop?" There was no pity in the question. That was what Simone noticed first. It was not the question people asked when they wanted to feel sad on her behalf. It was the question of someone conducting an assessment 3 months from submission, Simone said. "Family medical situation. I deferred and eventually stepped away." "McGill?" "Yes." "Supervisor?" Dr. Anand Krishnamurthy. "Celtic and Germanic convergence. Minority Language Preservation Policy. Dr. Fleury was quiet for a moment. I know Krishnamurthy's work. It's good work. She reached into the small card wallet she carried and produced a card with the same unhurried ease with which she did everything. I run a foundation. Among other things, we fund translators and linguistic researchers for healthcare access work. Specifically, communities in Quebec where neither English nor Standard French is the primary language at home. Cree, Inuktitut, Michif. We've recently begun looking at the Franco-Breton community in the Magdalen Islands. She held the card out. We've been looking for a senior researcher and liaison coordinator for 8 months. The role is designed to be paired with a return-to-study arrangement if the candidate wants to complete interrupted work. Simone looked at the card. She did not reach for it immediately. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. It was an honest question. It was not defensive or suspicious. It was simply honest, in the way that Simone was, at her core, honest about the things that mattered. Dr. Fleury almost smiled. It was the expression of someone who had been expecting exactly that response, and had found it satisfying. Because I have spent 30 years watching people perform competence in rooms like this one, Dr. Fleury said, and I know the real thing when I see it. You were not performing tonight. You were simply here. She tilted the card slightly. "Call the number on the back. My assistant will set something up." She returned to the table, retrieved her jacket from the back of her chair, and said her goodbyes to the 3 men with the brisk warmth of a woman who had given exactly as much of the evening as she had intended to give, and not a minute more. Whitfield watched her go. He watched Simone, who was now moving quietly between the tables as the other guests finished their evenings. He had the look of a man running and rerunning a calculation and arriving at a result he had not expected. One of his colleagues leaned in. "Good evening." Whitfield picked up his wineglass, found it empty, and set it back down. "She knew," he said after a moment. "Knew what?" "Everything," he said. "She knew everything in that room tonight. The wine? The cheese? The language? All of it." He was quiet again. "I came in here thinking I was the smartest person at this table." His colleague waited. "I wasn't," Whitfield said simply, and stood. He left a tip that Armand later described, with characteristic understatement, as appropriate. He did not linger. At the door, he paused for a moment and looked back into the dining room, and for just a second, Simone, who was resetting table 3 for the following evening, looked up and met his eye. He gave her a nod. Not an apology, exactly, not a concession, something more honest than either of those things, the acknowledgement, man to room, that the room had won. Then he was gone, and the door closed behind him, and Auberge St. Clair settled back into its quiet amber hum. Simone finished resetting the table. She aligned the cutlery with the automatic precision of someone who had done it 10,000 times, straightened the candle, smoothed the linen. She picked up Dr. Fleury's card from where she had tucked it into her apron pocket and looked at it for a long moment under the low light. She thought about her dissertation, which still lived in a folder on her laptop that she opened sometimes in the early mornings when she couldn't sleep, reading the chapters back to herself the way you might return to a letter you once wrote and never sent. She thought about her mother, who was in remission now, and who had started, in recent months, to make small plans again. A trip to Prince Edward Island in the summer, a cooking class at the community centre. She thought about the Breton-speaking families on the Magdalen Islands, which she had read about in the course of her research, and which had stayed with her as one of those facts that felt important in a way she couldn't fully articulate. She put the card back in her pocket. She turned off the lights over table 7. Outside, the frost had thickened on the cobblestones, and the street was empty and still, and Montreal went on being itself in the dark, old and cold and full of people who were quietly, in their various ways, more than they appeared.